That day, the children's hospital, which was usually quiet and heavy with the tension of treatments, suddenly became more vibrant than ever. The children were excited, their parents anxiously hopeful, and the medical staff worked diligently to finalize preparations. Everyone was anticipating a special moment, the visit of former President Donald Trump, not with the commanding presence he was known for, but with a heartfelt and compassionate spirit. The hospital hallways were brighter than usual. Hand-drawn pictures by the children were displayed everywhere. Colorful balloons floated on the ceilings. And somewhere in the background, the faint sound of children's laughter could be heard, a rare and precious sound amid the struggles of illness. As Trump walked through the main entrance, all eyes turned to him. Gone was the air of pride or the imposing demeanor of a political leader. Instead, he appeared with a gentle smile and eyes filled with empathy. He shook hands with the doctors, nodded warmly to the nurses at work, and spoke kindly with the parents. His soft but meaningful words seemed to infuse strength into them. People who had endured countless sleepless nights worrying for their children. "Today, I'm not here to talk about politics or work," Trump said, his voice warm and sincere. "I'm here to see the truly strong ones, the little warriors and their families." From one hallway to the next, from room to room, his presence was more than just a routine visit. It was like a ray of light, gently pushing away some of the darkness that accompanied the pain. The children smiled, the parents nodded with gratitude, and even the doctors, who faced challenges daily, seemed to feel encouraged. It wasn't just a special day, it was a day when love, hope, and compassion spread throughout the hospital, touching everyone in its reach. Donald Trump began his visit to the Children's Hospital with a sense of purpose. Moving from room to room, he greeted each child with genuine warmth, offering words of encouragement that seemed to momentarily lift the spirits of those facing the unimaginable. He knelt by hospital beds, shook small, trembling hands, and listened intently as parents shared their stories of courage, exhaustion, and a fierce determination to protect their children. His schedule was tight, but Trump made it clear he would give each family the time they deserved, ensuring his visit left an impact on every room he entered. As he made his way down one long hallway, the sound of muffled machines and occasional quiet conversations filled the air. Nearing the end of the corridor, he stopped abruptly. Something about a small room on the left seemed to catch his attention. The door was slightly ajar, and through the narrow opening, he caught sight of a little girl lying still on her hospital bed. She looked so delicate, her frail frame almost swallowed by the large, sterile bed. Her pale complexion hinted at the toll her illness had taken. But it wasn't her physical fragility that made Trump pause. It was her eyes, large, expressive, and filled with a quiet, extraordinary strength that seemed to defy the weariness of her body. They were the eyes of someone who had faced more battles than her young years should have ever allowed. The walls of the room told a story of hope and resilience. They were covered in vibrant, hand-drawn pictures, a bright blue sky with fluffy clouds, rabbits leaping through fields of green, and flowers bursting with color. Each drawing seemed to be a reflection of the life Emily longed to embrace beyond the confines of her hospital room. Yet today, the room's brightness seemed to contrast sharply with the stillness of its occupant. Emily lay quietly, clutching a worn teddy bear close to her chest, as if it were her anchor in a storm. Her energy appeared drained, her movements slow, but even in her stillness, there was something captivating about her presence. Trump's gaze lingered on the little girl. There was a pull he couldn't explain, something about her that made it impossible for him to move on. After a brief pause, he signaled to his team to wait in the hallway. He took a deep breath, gently pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The room seemed to exhale at his presence. A momentary break in the heavy quiet. Emily's parents, seated close to her bedside, immediately noticed his entrance. They quickly stood, their faces a mix of surprise and gratitude. The mother, a petite woman with tired eyes that mirrored her daughter's strength, tried to mask her tears. She glanced at Emily, then back at Trump, her voice soft but laden with emotion. "Emily has been looking forward to meeting you so much," she said, her words catching slightly in her throat. "But today, she isn't feeling very well." Emily's father placed a gentle hand on his wife's shoulder, as if to steady her. His own face bore the wear of long nights and countless prayers, but there was also a quiet pride in his eyes as he looked down at his daughter. Trump turned his attention to Emily. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Her eyes, though tired, seemed to light up slightly at the sight of him. Slowly, she adjusted her grip on the teddy bear and offered the faintest of smiles. Trump, usually so composed and confident, felt a lump rise in his throat. This wasn't a political meeting or a public appearance. This was a raw, unfiltered moment, one where the magnitude of a child's fight against illness rendered everything else insignificant. Trump approached Emily's bedside with a demeanor unlike what many were accustomed to seeing. Gone was the commanding presence of a leader addressing large crowds. Instead, he carried a quiet softness that seemed to fill the room. His steps were deliberate, and as he knelt beside her bed, his expression softened further. He lowered himself so that his eyes met hers, gently reaching out to take her small, frail hand in his. The contrast between his strong, steady hand and hers, delicate and almost weightless, was a stark reminder of the gravity of her battle. He gave her a warm smile, one that seemed to carry both reassurance and admiration, and spoke in a voice filled with genuine care. "Hello, Emily. I've heard so much about you. They tell me you're a very special and incredibly brave little girl." Emily, who had been lying quietly with her beloved teddy bear pressed close to her chest, slowly turned her gaze to him. Her pale lips curved into a faint but unmistakable smile. It was the kind of smile that carried immense effort, but also a spark of gratitude. She blinked, gathering the strength to respond. Her voice, though soft, was clear, and every word she spoke carried the weight of her exhaustion. "I don't think I'm as strong as everyone says. Mr. Trump, I'm so tired. Sometimes, I just want to give up." Her words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, exposing the vulnerability of a child burdened with more than any child should have to bear. Trump paused, visibly moved by her honesty. His grip on her hand tightened slightly, as if to silently reassure her that she wasn't alone. The room, already quiet, seemed to grow even stiller. The faint hum of medical equipment, the steady beeping of the heart monitor, and the occasional rustle of fabric became the only sounds breaking the silence. In the corner of the room, two nurses stood watching, their faces etched with compassion. Both had tears pooling in their eyes, their professional demeanor giving way to the deep humanity of the moment. Emily's parents stood near her bedside, holding onto each other tightly. Her mother, a petite woman with tired eyes, clung to her husband's arm as if drawing strength from his presence. Her father, a quiet man whose face bore the lines of countless sleepless nights, clasped his wife's hand tightly in his own. Both watched their daughter intently, their emotions raw but silent, as if not wanting to interrupt this fragile and profound exchange. After a brief silence, Emily's gaze shifted back to Trump. Her eyes, large and expressive, were filled with a mixture of sadness and confusion. She hesitated for a moment, as if trying to summon the courage to speak. Then, her voice, trembling but steady, broke the silence, a question that seemed to cut through the very soul of the room. "Mr. Trump, why does God let me go through so much pain? Did I do something wrong?" The simplicity of her question was devastating in its depth. In that moment, the weight of her words was palpable, and the air in the room seemed to thicken. The nurses standing in the corner wiped at their eyes, unable to hold back their emotions. Emily's mother let out a quiet sob, burying her face into her husband's shoulder, while her father turned his face upward, as if searching for answers in the ceiling tiles. Trump, usually a man quick with words, found himself momentarily speechless. He blinked, his expression shifting from surprise to something deeper, an almost visible struggle to hold back his own emotions. He took a deep breath, still holding Emily's hand tightly in his, and simply knelt there, letting the enormity of her question settle over him. There was no room for politics or pretense in this moment. Here was a child, small and fragile, bearing the weight of a question that countless adults had wrestled with for centuries. It was a question of faith, pain, and purpose, and it demanded an answer that could soothe a heart as weary as Emily's. The room remained hushed, as if everyone inside was collectively holding their breath, waiting for what Trump would say. For now, though, he simply stayed there, his presence alone speaking volumes in the stillness. Trump leaned in closer, his presence filling the small room with a calm stillness. His eyes, often steely and resolute, now brimmed with a compassion so profound it seemed to soften every line of his face. In that moment, it was as though the rest of the world faded away, leaving only him and Emily, a fragile little girl carrying a burden far too heavy for her tiny frame. He gently took Emily's frail hand in both of his, cradling it as if it were something precious and irreplaceable. Her hand, so small and delicate, trembled slightly in his grasp. Trump clasped it tighter, not to overpower, but to reassure, as if trying to transfer every ounce of warmth and strength he possessed to her. His voice, usually commanding and deliberate, now carried a softness that made it almost unrecognizable, slow and laden with emotion. It broke the silence that had enveloped the room. "Emily, you've done nothing wrong." He paused, the weight of his words hanging in the air, and then continued, his tone steady but deeply empathetic. "Sometimes, we have to face things we don't understand, challenges that feel deeply unfair, even impossible. But I want you to know this. I truly believe that God doesn't let us experience pain to punish us. He has a greater plan, Emily, one that we might not be able to see or understand right now." He stopped for a moment, his gaze meeting hers. Despite her obvious exhaustion, Emily's eyes remained clear and unwavering, as if searching for the truth in his words. Trump held her gaze, his expression one of quiet resolve, and when he spoke again, his voice softened even more, yet carried a powerful certainty. "I believe God chooses the strongest people to face the toughest battles, and you, Emily, are one of the strongest people I've ever met. You're not just a patient, you're a warrior. You bring hope and inspiration to everyone around you, from your parents to the doctors and nurses, and even to me. Emily, you're teaching all of us about love and what it truly means to be strong." Emily didn't respond right away, her expression thoughtful and still. Her large, tired eyes glistened with unshed tears as she absorbed his words. For a few long moments, the room was silent, save for the faint hum of medical machines and the steady beeping of her heart monitor. Then, a single tear escaped, rolling slowly down her cheek. But it wasn't a tear of despair. It was something else, something far deeper, as if reflecting the subtle shift in her spirit. A faint smile began to spread across her pale face. It was gentle, barely there, but it lit up her features in a way that made everyone in the room hold their breath. In that fleeting moment, the weight of her exhaustion seemed to lift, if only slightly, replaced by a spark of something new, hope. The nurses in the corner of the room wiped their eyes, their professionalism giving way to raw emotion. Emily's parents, standing nearby, clutched each other tightly, tears streaming down their faces. Her mother brought a trembling hand to her lips, unable to contain the mix of relief and pride swelling in her chest. Her father stood silently, his shoulders shaking, his face a mixture of gratitude and awe. Even Trump, a man who had faced countless challenges and controversies on the world stage, appeared visibly moved. He stayed kneeling beside her, his large frame almost dwarfed by the enormity of the moment. He didn't say anything else for a while. He simply stayed there, holding Emily's hand, as if to let her know she wasn't alone. The atmosphere in the room was unlike anything anyone had felt before. It was as if something invisible but profoundly powerful had swept through, leaving an indelible mark on every heart present. Emily, in her quiet strength, had become a beacon, not just for those who loved her, but for everyone who would hear her story. And Trump, a leader so often defined by his power, found himself humbled by the courage of a child. Trump adjusted his position slightly, leaning in closer to Emily, his large hand gently enclosing her small, frail one. The gesture was steady, as if he were trying to pass on some of his strength to her, willing her to feel the warmth and support that his presence offered. His expression softened, his eyes reflecting both the gravity of the moment and the sincerity of the words he was about to share. His voice, warm and low, carried a weight that commanded attention. But it wasn't the voice of a leader addressing a crowd. It was personal, intimate, and filled with a quiet reverence. "Emily," he began, his tone deliberate and calm. "I want to tell you about a boy I once met. He was a lot like you, facing a very serious illness that made every day a challenge. There were days when he was so tired, he couldn't even find the strength to smile. He told me he felt like there was no hope left. And sometimes, he wanted to give up entirely." Trump paused for a moment, his gaze shifting slightly, as though he were pulling the memory from a deep and meaningful place in his heart. Emily's eyes, though weary, stayed fixed on his, her small fingers twitching faintly in his grip. She was listening intently, drawn into the story as if it were being told just for her. And, in a way, it was. "But you know something, Emily?" Trump continued, his voice growing softer, yet steadier. He wasn't alone. His family, his friends, and all the people who loved him were there for him, every step of the way. They reminded him that no matter how hard it got, he had so many reasons to keep going. They helped him see that his fight wasn't just his own. It was for all of them, too. Trump glanced briefly at Emily's parents, who were standing just behind him. Her mother had her hand pressed to her lips, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Her father's arms were crossed tightly over his chest, as if trying to keep himself from breaking under the weight of the moment. Trump met their eyes for a split second, his look conveying an unspoken acknowledgement of their own bravery. Before he turned his attention back to Emily, his expression shifted slightly, a faint smile crossing his lips as a distant memory seemed to come alive in his mind. He spoke again, this time with a renewed sense of purpose. "Then one day," he said, "this boy realized something incredible. Every time he smiled, every little step he took forward, even on the hardest days, it didn't just make him stronger. It gave hope to the people around him, his parents, his doctors, his friends. They all drew strength from him, and that gave him a new kind of courage. He didn't give up, Emily. He kept fighting. And do you know what happened? His courage didn't just change his life. It changed the lives of so many others, including mine." Trump's voice grew quieter as he reached this part of the story, but the conviction behind his words only deepened. His gaze locked with Emily's, and the room seemed to shrink around them, as if they were the only two people there. Emily's tired eyes, large and expressive, searched his face for something, perhaps hope, perhaps understanding. Whatever it was, she seemed to find it. Trump leaned in just slightly, his voice now firm but still gentle, filled with a mix of tenderness and admiration. "Emily, you're just like that boy. You may not realize it, but you're not just fighting for yourself. You're teaching all of us, your parents, the doctors and nurses, even me, what real courage and strength look like. You're not just a patient, you're a warrior. And more than that, you're a gift that God has sent to this world. You're here to remind us all that even in the hardest, toughest times, faith and love never go away. They endure." The room grew utterly still, as if every breath had been drawn in and held. Trump's words hung in the air, their weight palpable. For a moment, even the faint hum of the machines and the rhythmic beeping of Emily's heart monitor seemed to fade into the background. All eyes were on her. Emily didn't speak right away. Her small chest rose and fell steadily, and her tired but bright eyes seemed to hold a spark that hadn't been there before. Slowly, a single tear escaped, tracing a delicate path down her cheek. But it wasn't a tear of sadness or fear. It was something else entirely. It carried a quiet acknowledgement of the truth in Trump's words, a recognition of her own strength, even if she hadn't seen it before. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, fragile but undeniably real. In that moment, the exhaustion that had weighed so heavily on her seemed to lift, if only slightly, replaced by a glimmer of newfound hope. Around her, the atmosphere shifted. Her mother let out a small, trembling sob and reached for her husband's arm. He pulled her close, resting his chin on her head as tears slid down his own face. The nurses, standing quietly in the corner, wiped their eyes, their professional facades giving way to the raw emotion of the moment. Even Trump, who had faced some of the most intense challenges and debates imaginable, seemed humbled, his own eyes glistening as he continued to kneel by Emily's bedside. Emily was silent, but in her stillness, there was something powerful. She didn't need to speak. Her presence, her courage, and the small but unmistakable spark in her eyes said more than words ever could. Emily remained silent for a few moments after Trump finished speaking, her small, frail body still as if she were trying to process his words. Her eyes, which had been dulled by exhaustion and tinged with sadness, slowly began to change. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but a gradual shift, like the first rays of sunlight breaking through a heavy cloud. A small but undeniable spark began to flicker within her gaze, a quiet sign of something deeper awakening. She adjusted her hand in Trump's grasp, the tiny movement almost imperceptible but significant in its own way. With a trembling voice, faint but clear, she finally spoke, her words carefully chosen but carrying a strength that belied her fragile state. "I don't know if I can be as strong as you say," she began, her tone wavering yet laced with determination. "But I'll try. I'll try for my parents, for the people who love me, and for you." Her words were soft, barely above a whisper, but they carried the power of a roaring declaration. They echoed in the hearts of everyone present, like a gentle breeze stirring embers into flames. It was a moment that didn't require loud proclamations or grand gestures, just the raw, quiet resolve of a little girl who refused to give up. Emily's parents, standing a few feet away, were overcome with emotion. Her mother's hands flew to her mouth as tears streamed freely down her face. They weren't tears of fear or grief this time, but tears of pride, an overwhelming pride in her daughter's courage. Emily's father, normally a man of quiet strength, found himself wiping his eyes, his stoic demeanor giving way to the sheer depth of his feelings. He reached for his wife, pulling her close as they both stood rooted in awe of their little girl. Trump, kneeling by Emily's bedside, watched the scene unfold with a kind of reverence. For a man who had spent much of his life in the spotlight, commanding rooms and navigating tough debates, this moment was entirely different. There was no crowd to impress, no cameras capturing his every move, just the raw, unfiltered connection between a powerful leader and a small, incredibly brave child. His eyes, usually sharp and focused, now glistened with unshed tears of admiration. Gently, as if afraid to disturb the fragile beauty of the moment, Trump reached out and brushed a strand of Emily's thin, wispy hair away from her face. His hand lingered for a second longer, a silent gesture of both care and respect. When he spoke, his voice was steady but warm, as if he were making a solemn vow that he intended to keep. "You don't have to be strong all by yourself, Emily," he said, his tone carrying both reassurance and resolve. "We'll be here for you, your parents, the doctors, and even me. We'll fight this together." The words, simple yet profound, seemed to carry a weight that filled the room. Emily's small smile grew a little wider, her tired eyes reflecting a quiet gratitude. She didn't say anything more, but she didn't need to. Her expression, filled with both exhaustion and hope, said everything that words couldn't. The room itself seemed to brighten, not with light, but with a palpable sense of connection and shared strength. The nurses standing quietly in the corner exchanged glances, their own eyes brimming with tears. One of them brought a hand to her chest, as if trying to steady her emotions, while the other wiped her cheeks quickly, hoping to maintain her composure. Even the hum of the machines and the steady beeping of the heart monitor seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the intangible but undeniable presence of hope. Trump remained kneeling by Emily's side for a moment longer, as if unwilling to break the connection. In that instant, it was clear to everyone present that this was more than just a visit, more than just a fleeting interaction. It was a promise, a shared understanding that no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, Emily would never have to face it alone. For those who witnessed it, the scene wasn't just moving, it was transformative. It was a moment where courage, love, and unwavering support converged, creating a bond that would stay with them forever. Though Emily's battle was far from over, one thing was certain: she had an army of love and strength standing firmly behind her, ready to fight alongside her every step of the way. As Trump prepared to leave the room, he hesitated at the doorway, glancing back at Emily. Her frail frame seemed so small against the stark white of the hospital bed, but there was an undeniable strength in her eyes, a quiet courage that had touched something deep within him. He turned back, stepping closer to her bedside one last time, his large frame casting a protective shadow over the tiny warrior lying before him. Lowering himself so he was at her level, Trump leaned in, his hands gently resting on the edge of the bed. His expression was uncharacteristically soft, and his eyes shone with a mix of gratitude and deep sincerity. For a moment, he seemed to struggle to find the right words, as if anything he could say might not fully capture the profound impact Emily had made on him. Then, in a voice that carried the weight of both a promise and a plea, he spoke, each word resonating with emotion. "Emily, you're not just a warrior. You're someone who has taught me, and everyone in this room, a lesson we'll never forget. You've shown us what it truly means to be strong, even when life feels impossible. Never give up, no matter how hard things get. I promise you, from the bottom of my heart, that I will do everything in my power to help children like you. You are a gift, Emily, a light that this world desperately needs." His words hung in the air, filling the room with a sense of profound connection. They weren't just for Emily, they were for everyone present: her parents, standing just a few feet away, seemed to draw strength from his words. Her mother's face crumpled as fresh tears began to fall. But this time, they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of pride, of hope, and of gratitude. Her father, usually so stoic, let his shoulders shake as he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Together, they held Emily's small hands tighter, as if grounding themselves in the bravery their daughter exuded. The nurses and doctors in the room, seasoned professionals who had witnessed countless moments of both triumph and tragedy, found themselves deeply moved. One nurse discreetly dabbed at her eyes with the sleeve of her scrubs, while another stood motionless, her hands clasped tightly together as if in silent prayer. Even the hum of the machine seemed softer, as though the very atmosphere of the room had shifted under the weight of Trump's words. Trump lingered for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on Emily's face. She looked back at him, her tired eyes reflecting a glimmer of something new, hope. Her small smile, fragile yet radiant, seemed to convey a silent acknowledgement of his promise. Finally, Trump stood, towering over the little girl who had managed to touch his heart in a way few others ever had. He straightened his jacket and took a deep breath, as though steeling himself for the task he knew lay ahead. "Thank you, Emily," he said softly, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "You've reminded me of what really matters." With those final words, he turned and walked toward the door, his usual commanding stride tempered by a newfound humility. But as he reached the threshold, he paused again, looking back over his shoulder. For a brief moment, their eyes met one last time, and it was clear that this was not the end of their connection. It was only the beginning. The scene in the room remained frozen in time, etched into the memories of everyone who had witnessed it. Emily's story, and Trump's heartfelt response to her, would not remain confined to those walls. It was the kind of moment that had the power to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the confines of that hospital. Though the visit ended there, Trump's commitment didn't stop with words. As he left the hospital, his mind was already racing with ideas. He knew that promises alone weren't enough. Action was required. Inspired by Emily's courage, he began to lay the groundwork for something much bigger. The story of Emily is not just about a little girl bravely fighting her illness. It is a symbol of strength, faith, and compassion. Through Trump's heartfelt and inspiring words, we are reminded that no matter how challenging life may become, there are always rays of hope and acts of kindness to hold on to. Whatever challenges you are facing in life, remember that you are not alone. There are people around you who are ready to reach out, to help you walk through the toughest of days. And you, with your courage and love, can also become a source of inspiration and strength for others. May you always find light in the darkest moments, hope in the smallest things, and love in the hearts of those around you. Stay strong, for courage and kindness have the power to change the world. Emily's story is a reminder that even when life feels harsh and unforgiving, we can come together to make it better, live with faith and a heart full of love.